You learned how to need less before you ever learned how to ask. And people called that maturity because it made everyone else more comfortable. You were the child who did not want to be a problem. So you got very good at disappearing before your needs could disappoint someone. Now you handle everything alone and call it strength. But deep down, it often feels less like strength and more like exile. Hyper-independence rarely begins as confidence. It usually begins as a quiet conclusion that no one is really coming. Not because nobody loved you in obvious ways, but because your inner world was not met often enough to feel safe depending on anyone. Maybe you were fed, clothed, and taken to school on time, but your sadness felt inconvenient, your fear was brushed past, and your sensitivity was treated like too much. So you started editing yourself early. You learned which feelings got ignored, which ones got minimized, and which ones made the room go cold. That kind of child does not stop needing care. They just stop expecting it in a form they can actually trust. And that is where the pattern hardens. If comfort is uncertain, self-reliance starts to feel like the only stable ground. As an adult, this can look impressive from the outside. You pay your bills, solve your crises, stay composed, and rarely ask for rescue. People admire how capable you are. They do not always see how exhausting it is to never fully lean. You may be the one everyone calls in an emergency. But when your own life starts cracking, your first instinct is to go silent. You tell yourself you have got it. You tell other people not to worry, even when your chest already feels crowded. There is a specific loneliness in being known as dependable. It can make people trust your strength while completely missing your hunger. Because hyper-independence is not just doing things alone. It is feeling safer when nobody can touch the vulnerable parts of you. It is answering "I'm fine" before you have even checked. It is saying, "Don't worry about me," while secretly wishing someone would. It is offering help faster than receiving it. It is carrying groceries, emotions, plans, and disappointments like your body was built for load-bearing. The world rewards people who do not ask for much. It praises the child who was easy, the student who was mature, the partner who was low maintenance. But what gets rewarded is not always what is healthy. Sometimes it is just what causes the least disruption to other people. A child who becomes hyper-independent is often adapting to emotional unpredictability. They learn that depending on others brings tension, guilt, shame, or nothing at all. So they cut the circuit early. They decide, often without words, that needing less hurts less. This decision can happen in very ordinary homes. It does not always require chaos, screaming, or obvious cruelty. Emotional neglect is often subtle that way. It leaves no dramatic scene, only a child who feels strangely alone inside their own life. No one may have told you not to feel, but if your feelings were regularly bypassed, your nervous system still got the message. If joy was tolerated but grief was rushed, you learned to compress. If anger felt dangerous, you learned to stay agreeable. If your parents were overwhelmed, fragile, distracted, or emotionally elsewhere, you may have learned to become easy to carry, then eventually impossible to reach. They remember everything, handle themselves, and ask for little. Adults love how good they are without asking what that goodness is costing. A child should not have to earn softness by being undemanding, but many do. So adulthood becomes full of strange contradictions. You want closeness but feel trapped when someone gets too near. You want support, but start managing the moment the second it appears. You say yes to care with your mouth and no with your body. Someone offers help, and your first reaction is tension. Not because they are unsafe, but because being helped wakes up something old. It brings back the ancient risk of needing, and needing, in your system, was never a simple thing. Maybe it came with disappointment. Maybe it came with being called dramatic, selfish, needy, spoiled, or too sensitive. Maybe it came with a parent who helped physically but resented it emotionally. So you learned that receiving support could create debt. That is why hyper-independent people often struggle to relax around kindness. Kindness is not always the hard part. Trusting it is. You may notice this in tiny moments. Someone says, "I can take care of that," and your body answers, "No, I'll do it." Not because the task matters so much, but because control feels safer than vulnerability. So you become incredibly efficient. You anticipate, organize, prepare, and overfunction before anyone can fail you. You might feel guilty resting while other people are working. You might feel guilty resting even when no one asked anything of you. Because somewhere inside, rest got tied to irresponsibility. If you were the emotionally responsible one too early, Stillness can feel almost immoral. So even your exhaustion becomes private. You clean the house tired, answer texts tired, drive home tired, and call it normal. You may not even realize how deep this goes. Hyper-independence can become so woven into identity that it feels like personality, not protection. You tell yourself, you just like being self-sufficient. You tell yourself it is easier this way, and sometimes it is. There is also grief buried inside this pattern, not only for what you lacked, but for who you had to become to survive the lack. The child in you may have learned to be impressive instead of comforted, to be useful instead of held. And when usefulness becomes your safest role, your worth starts to feel conditional. You matter when you perform, provide, fix, or absorb. That can follow you into every room. At work, you become the one who can handle impossible deadlines without complaint. In friendships, you become the steady one who listens for hours and then says very little about yourself. In relationships, you confuse being needed with being loved. You might choose partners who love your strength but cannot meet your softness, or partners who want intimacy while you keep handing them competence instead. Because competence is easier to share than tenderness. Tenderness has memory attached to it. When someone asks, "How are you really?" you may freeze for a second, not because you are hiding something dramatic, but because you were never trained to check. So you say you were fine, then cry in the shower 2 days later. You say it did not bother you, then feel heavy all evening without knowing why. This is not dishonesty. It is what happens when emotional awareness had to develop around self-protection. If no one helped you name your inner experience, you may have learned to move straight from feeling into function. No pause and no language, just adaptation. That is why some hyper-independent people look incredibly composed in a crisis. The old training returns fast. When something goes wrong, your system does not ask, "Who can help me?" It asks a different question first. What needs to be handled before anyone notices I'm struggling? And eventually, the cost starts showing up. Maybe not in one dramatic collapse, but in chronic emptiness, irritability, numbness, or relationships that never feel fully mutual. You start realizing that being the strong one all the time does not actually feel strong. It feels lonely, suspicious, and heavy. Someone buys you dinner and you feel behind. Someone comforts you and you start wondering how to repay them. That is not greed or coldness. It is often the old fear that love becomes dangerous once you owe something. For many emotionally neglected people, dependence was never modeled as safe and mutual. It felt unstable, loaded, or humiliating. So your adult self tries to avoid that entire terrain. Better to be the one who gives than the one who might be at someone else's mercy. But complete self-reliance is not peace. It is often a form of permanent bracing. It keeps your light functional, yet your heart underfed. It protects you from disappointment, but also from the softness that would challenge your old conclusions. They sound like wisdom because they kept you stable, but stability and safety are not always the same thing. Sometimes what kept you stable as a child keeps you lonely as an adult. That is the harder truth. Because hyper-independence does not only block pain, it can block delight, spontaneity, comfort, and the deeply human experience of being supported without shame. It can make love feel abstract. You know people care, but you do not know how to let that care reach your nervous system. So even good relationships can feel strangely tiring. Someone gets close, and you start managing the closeness instead of resting inside it. This is where many people start blaming themselves. Why can't I just open up? Why does care make me tense? But shame is the wrong lens here. Your pattern makes sense. It was built by repetition, by being emotionally alone too many times during the exact years when the brain learns what connection is supposed to feel like. That matters because it changes the story. It means your distance is not proof that you do not need people. It is proof that needing people once felt expensive, and your system got smart. Still, survival intelligence can outlive the environment that created it. That is why this pattern deserves compassion, but not automatic loyalty. What protected you at 9 may be starving you at 29. What made you admirable at 14 may make intimacy nearly impossible at 34. There is a difference between capability and guardedness. One gives you options, the other quietly removes them. Real strength is not never needing anything. Real strength is being able to need, choose, trust, and still remain yourself. Maybe the first shift is not traumatic openness. Maybe it is simply noticing the moment you say, "I've got it," when you actually want help. Maybe it is letting someone carry one bag without explaining why it feels bigger than a bag. Because sometimes the smallest acts hit the oldest wounds. You are not weak for finding that difficult. You are touching the place where self-protection became identity. The goal is not to become helpless. It is not to swing from hyper-independence into total dependence. The goal is something quieter and far more mature. To stop treating your needs like a threat to your worth. To answer "how are you" with something more honest than your most practiced line, even if that honesty comes slowly. Because the opposite of emotional neglect is not traumatic confession. It is being met, little by little, without punishment. Grief for how early you had to become composed. Grief for how many rooms praised your independence while ignoring the child who built it out of loneliness. You may realize you were never hard to love. You were just early to adapt. You were never too much for having needs. You were simply around people who could not always meet them without making you feel like a burden. That distinction can change everything. Because burdensome was never your nature. It was a feeling you absorbed. And once you see that, hyper-independence stops looking like your personality carved in stone. It starts looking like a strategy, intelligent but costly. You do not have to hate the version of you that survived by needing less. That version was trying to keep your heart intact with the tools it had. But you also do not have to spend the rest of your life proving you can carry everything alone. There is nothing healed about being unreachable. So if receiving love still feels unfamiliar, that does not mean you are broken. It may just mean your nervous system is still waiting for proof. And if rest makes you uneasy, if help makes you tense, if closeness makes you want to retreat, that does not erase your capacity for connection. It reveals the shape of the wound. You are not only the one who handles everything, you are also the one who deserves to be handled gently. And maybe that is the line worth keeping. Hyper-independence was the way you survived, not being emotionally held, but it was never the fullest truth of you.